Honorable Speaker and my distinguished colleagues, my name is Honorable Kolawole Gabriel Babatunde. From Ondo State, I represent Akoko Southeast Southwest Federal Constituency. I rise to move a motion on the need for investigation of the non-remittance of contributions by the federal government, state governments, and local governments into the Nigerian Social Insurance Trust Fund, NSITF, from 2010 to date. The House recalls that the National Assembly passed the Employees Compensation Act in 2010 to provide an open and fair system of guaranteed and adequate compensation for all employees or their dependents for any death, injury, disease, or disability arising out of or in the course of employment, rehabilitation to employees with work-related disabilities, establishment and maintenance of a solvent compensation fund managed in the interests of employees and employers, among others. Note that by Section 33 of the Act, every employer shall, within the first 2 years of the commencement of this Act, make a minimum monthly contribution of 1.0% of the total monthly payroll into the fund, and subsequently, payment will be based on estimates of the employer's payroll for the year, actual assessment, or based on minimum assessment. Also notes that private sector players have to a reasonable extent been complying with the provisions of the Act, particularly in view of Section 16(6)(d), which makes it mandatory for bidders to fulfill all obligations to pay taxes, pensions, and social security contributions. However, the federal government, states, and local government have all failed to make payments of their contributions to the NSITF, despite the mandatory provision of the Act. Further notes that the definition of an employer under Section 73 of the Act is broad and covers all levels of government, given that it defines an employer to include any individual, body, corporate, federal, state, or local government, or any of the government agencies which has entered into a contract of employment to employ any other person as an employee or apprentice. Cognizance that by failing, refusing, or neglecting to pay the statutory contributions to the NSITF, government at all levels are not only violating the law of the land, but are equally exposing the vast majority of the Nigerian workforce to uninsured and uncovered risk and occupational hazards. And by extension, those large pool of workers cannot be compensated for injuries, mental stress, occupational diseases, hearing impairment, total and partial disability, or disfigurement, among others. Aware that only members of the armed forces, excluding civilian employees of the armed forces, are exempted from the mandatory employer contribution under the Act. Observe that if this anomaly is not addressed, civil and public servants will continue to be shortchanged and remain at the receiving end of a system that exposes them to occupational hazard without any form of insurance or compensation. Resolve to set up another committee to investigate the non-remittance of the Nigerian Social Insurance Trust Fund contributions by the federal, states, and local governments, and several federal government statutory bodies, and report back within 6 weeks for further legislative action. I so move. You will recall early this year that some association of pensioners paid Mr. Speaker a courtesy call, and in responding to their request, I saw the passion with which Mr. Speaker addressed issues that were tabled before him. And I'm glad to announce to members that this motion will serve as an en route to finding solutions to some of the hazards, occupational hazards that are faced by Nigerian workers. I'm therefore saying that standing with this motion is standing with Nigerian workers. The International Labour Organization, in its statistical bulletin, made it clear that about 2 million workers die annually, while about 5,000 die on a daily basis. And this is traced to hazards that they are exposed to in their workplace. And that's what actually gave birth to the contributory pension scheme, which is, of course, an enactment of this parliament. But regrettably, in the course of my findings, I discovered that just few in the private sectors have been complying with this piece of legislation, while the federal government, the state and the local government have refused to substantially comply when it comes to payment of their own part of this contribution. Our workers are suffering on a daily basis, and those that have served this country meritoriously are outside there suffering. Their dependents are suffering. This act was enacted to provide compensation for workers that faced death in the course of their service, or those that were exposed to one form of ailment or the other. I don't see any reason why we should make a law in this hallowed chamber, and these laws are not complied with by our relevant agencies. So what this motion is calling for is just an investigation from 2010 up to date to the reason why these 3 tiers of government have refused to comply when it comes to the payment of their own parts of this contributory pension scheme. I'm therefore appealing to members to support this motion. Let's stand with the Nigerian workers so that we can put an end to the suffering of our people and also ensure that we move forward. There's no way we can have a sustainable economy when we have a very weak workforce. So for us to move this country forward, we must investigate this very matter and ensure that the right thing is done. Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I so move.